Hello, this is iBookBinding podcast, the second part of our talk with Emily K. Bell, who's a conservator at Wellesley College and author of a fascinating series of articles on the history of bookbinding that she's been working on for 3 years now and publishing it in the newsletter of the Guild of Bookwalkers. Yesterday we had to make a sudden break because I nearly fainted mid-interview. Hopefully today everything goes fine. And I thought we'd start by continuing the last topic we discussed yesterday, which was the book covers, what they were made of, and how it changed over time. So we discussed using boards. We discussed using cardboard,
wooden boards.
Wooden boards, yeah. We discussed using cardboard, which is a relatively modern innovation, but it wasn't the last one. So what were the following innovations when they came in and how they spread?
I guess not only the following, but what was in the middle, because we started discussing limb vellum bindings, and I wanted to hear a bit more about what else was there, because I know, for example, that there was this method when sheets of paper were sort of laminated together and to make boards or something like that, and I guess there were some other strange variants of how to cover your books. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure, and actually I think now might be a good time to share one of these charts that I've come up with.
Okay.
So here's one that I thought was kind of helpful for what we were talking about yesterday with different kinds of board. Pasteboard is actually what you were talking about, with layers of paper pasted together to create a board. And they're surprisingly old. Mm-hmm. There's a conjecture that this may have started in Spain, mm-hmm. and that it might be as early as the 14th century. So I'm not sure how well supported that is, but there are definitely some in France in the mid 14th century. One of the sources that I had has a really good survey of early French bindings from this period. So that's where I first heard of this idea of laminated boards. So you can kind of see that spreading from Spain to France, and then later in England, you find it in the 16th century. So that's kind of an interesting sort of journey through space. So that's one of those innovations that got spread slowly through the centuries from one place to another. So that's kind of an interesting one. Another version of that is this couched waterleaf board. What that means is that when you're actually creating the sheets of paper, a fresh sheet of paper is known as waterleaf before it's been pressed and dried. So you can actually, when the paper pulp is still really wet, you can just couch the sheets of paper right on top of each other and build up a thick board this way. And that seems to have been done in France in the 16th century, but there's not much evidence of it having been done elsewhere. That doesn't mean it wasn't, but that's where we've seen it. So
I also like the variety of materials in England in the 19th century. What's rope millboard and what's strawboard?
Yes, so millboard is basically a pulped up material that is sort of wetted and then squashed together to make what we think of as sort of a cardboard-like material. True millboard is made from rope remnants. So this is probably hemp rope. And it actually, it's very dark in color because it's old chunks of rope, but it has really strong fibers because the fibers used to make rope are pretty substantial. So these are actually pretty good quality boards, and they were used for a while because they would still take good impressions of tooling and stamping. So you get these nice crisp impressions from tools in this millboard. So that's a really durable board. It's kind of too bad that it's not found anymore because it's a good quality material. Strawboard is sort of one of those fun 18th, 19th century experiments. There was a guy who was trying to come up with new materials to make paper out of. And because rags were becoming harder and harder to come by. And the demand for lots of paper cheaply available was outstripping the supply of rags.
And that's I guess a topic that we should dedicate one of our bookish talks to, the rag crisis, the European rag crisis.
Absolutely. That's a very interesting one too. And so there was a guy in England who was coming up with other materials that could be used to make paper out of. And he was doing some experiments with straw. And he got a patent for making straw-based paper, and he actually published, this is fun, he published a book about straw paper on straw paper. Like the book was actually printed on the paper he had come up with. So it wasn't much of a commercial success, and so it kind of collapsed after a while, but it was also for a while being used to make boards. So this is just a really cheap material. You can actually sometimes, if you're taking a book apart, or if you've got a book that's coming apart, you can sometimes see this stuff. It's really, I mean, it looks like what you see in a barn. You know, it looks like straw. It's yellowish, it's flaky, it's very dry, and it's kind of an interesting material. But it's not very durable. Straw is pretty acidic, and it kind of eats itself from the inside. So,
so it was basically one manufacturer who was making those.
Yeah, I think a couple of different places might have tried it as well once he had patented it, but it wasn't really popular.
Do you know anything about the sources of the used rope fiber? Because the one thing I know about rope fiber is that they made them in workhouses. Because especially in Victorian England, they thought that people who need the state's help also need to work. And they were often doing things that looked rather pointless, like crushing stones. And for women and children, it was untangling old rope. Did it come from there?
It's entirely possible. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly where it came from. I'm sure, you know, with England being a very maritime focused country, I'm sure it had lots of leftover rope from sailing ships. I think that's probably where it comes from. It's waste material from sailing. You know, when a rope wears out, part of it is still useful, but it's not as long as it used to be, right? So yeah, I can imagine this is probably something that, you know, waifs and orphans in the workhouse were picking it apart. It's just like the rag pickers in Victorian England. They were going around collecting stuff from the trash. They also collected bone fragments to be burnt for ash. I'm not sure what they use that stuff for. I think it's actually in the textile industry, they use it for some part of the bleaching process, I think, is bone ash. So yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be a surprise to find out that that's exactly where these rope scraps are coming from.
Another thing that I noticed on this graph is switch from oak wood to beech wood over the course of the 11th and 12th century in Germany. What brought that about? What are your thoughts?
You know, that's a good question. I'd actually have to look back at the article that goes with this to tell you. Yeah, I found that interesting too, but that seems to be the case, that there was a switch. It's entirely possible that it's more about what part of Germany you're talking about. So the oak wood bindings are in the Carolingian period, in the Carolingian style. And the beechwood ones are later in the Romanesque and Gothic period. So we might actually be talking here more about the group of books that were used for the sample of Carolingian bindings are actually from one part of Germany, and the groups of books for the Romanesque and Gothic periods are from a different part of Germany. There are different climates. It's a large country, right? So there are different areas that have different combinations of trees growing there. And what I found with materials like wooden boards and with leather, most binders were using what was locally available. So you're not going to ship wooden boards a long distance from one place to another. So just because you really like working with oak wood, you're not necessarily going to import it from somewhere else if you can get beechwood nearby that's cheaper.
Painters did ship the wood from afar. Say, Baltic oak was used all over Northern Europe. Are there any qualities of wood, like how they react to temperature, to humidity? I know that Italians and, say, Germans or Netherlandish artists use different woods because of different climates. You wouldn't use oak in Italy, not just because it was expensive, but because it reacts much worse to hot climes.
I think too, the qualities of the wood vary not only by type, but by the climate that it grows in. So some wood has a much tighter grain, a much closer grain, which if you're doing any kind of sculpting, you're going to want that because you're going to get a nice sharp relief in your sculpture. So, but if you're doing something where, you're binding a book that you're not going to particularly do much shaping to the boards, it might be fine to use a softer wood or a wood that's less friendly in its grain, I suppose. So I think quite possibly people were deciding which, if they had a choice, if they had multiple choices, if there were different species of tree that grew nearby, I think they would probably make their choice based on how durable the wood is and how easy it is to work, to carve, to shape, and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's true that if you store wood in a not particularly stable environment, it's going to react to that. So that's something to take into consideration too. A lot of the sort of changes in how people attached their wooden boards to the book, how they drilled their holes, where they put the holes, is changed over time because they were trying to figure out how to keep the board from splitting. So if you have a chunk of wood and you drill holes all in one line, then you've created a weak point in the board and it'll crack right along that line. So binders started to stagger where the holes were so that you don't get all the holes lined up and you don't weaken the board in one place. So that's something that they were certainly thinking about. And I think if you're an experienced woodworker, you know more about this. And they probably talked to their carpentry friends. I can't imagine why they wouldn't. And so that would be, one thing to take into consideration is how easily can you drill holes in it and keep it from cracking.
Another example that comes to mind is what they had to do to old Italian paintings in northern collections in 18th and 19th century, when they had to transfer it to canvas, which sounds innocuous enough, but what it actually involves is putting the paint down, taking an axe and shaving all the wood and leaving only the paint. When you hear that, I mean, imagine those people that had to do that in late 18th century St. Petersburg, the paintings by Raphael and Da Vinci. I mean, that sounds just scary. I also wanted to, you said that they mostly sourced their wood locally. Is it also the case for the leather?
Yeah, definitely. You see different species of animal used in different places.
And we do know much more about the species of leather and vellum used now than we knew just a few decades ago, because
Right.
it's been a hot topic, right? Identifying the leathers and the vellums. And I saw those really weird combinations, like where every second quire would be made out of goat or something like that.
Right. But yes, it's definitely true that you have your local animals. So in England, you get sheep and goats a lot, right? Because they raise goats and sheep. But it looks like in a lot of places, especially the earlier bindings, they were using wild animals that they caught.
That is
So you get, yeah, so you get deer skin. A really interesting tidbit from France was that the king granted a specific monastery license to hunt in one of his parks, and to specifically so that they could use the skin for binding.
Mhm.
And I just thought that was a fascinating little detail. Like, that seems like such an interesting, well, it's obviously something that wouldn't happen now, but at the time it was a big deal, right? To get permission to hunt in the king's forest so that you could actually use the deer that you caught to bind books with. How interesting. But yeah, I mean, and I think you were also asking, Pavel, about pages in a single signature that's made of parchment, where you've got different animals in the same signature, right? Yeah, that definitely did happen. And I think it's also probably a question of what you could get and what kind of economics were involved. So if you're a monk and you're looking for skins to make books out of, and you've got a flock of animals that you're caring for, and maybe you've got different animals in the flock, so you use what you have on hand. It's it's a really fascinating area of study, and I don't know that, I mean, I would love to know more about that, because that's such an interesting intersection of the really hyper local economy, like your own monastery's flock of animals, and some trade, I'm sure, would have certainly gone on, but it just seems like such a local thing. You know, why ship these things when they're available everywhere?
And at the same time, the product, the books themselves were imported globally. I mean, there was an awful lot, a lot of trade. Say, Italian books pop up all over Europe, but then a book is much cheaper to transport than leather or wood.
Yeah,
If
right.
you
Finished object. Yeah.
yeah. But then most of the trade at that time, international trade, was trade in luxury objects, because it was too expensive to ship something in bulk. A few questions on this chart too. What's a tawed skin? Not all of these terms are familiar to me.
Sure. So there's a difference between a tanned skin and a tawed skin, and it goes down to chemistry. Tanning is done, well, especially historically, with acidic processes, chemically speaking. And tawing is typically done with alum, which is alkaline. So it's a different chemical process. Both of them are designed to keep the skin from rotting, but they do it in different ways. There are lots of different ways to tan, there are different materials that have been used, most of them pretty disgusting historically. You know, dog feces was really popular. In the New World, actually, the tanning process that the Native Americans used was with brains, you know, from the animals that they killed. They used the brain as part of the tanning process. And it's you know, urine was really popular because it's acidic.
And I read that it's not just any urine. You would really prefer to use either the abbot's urine because he had a better diet, or a red-headed boy's urine for some reason.
I can't imagine why, but there was a reason, I'm sure.
Another country.
So there are a lot of recipes for tanning, and tawed skin, on the other hand, typically uses alum and some other materials as well, but that's sort of the primary thing. And visually, physically, you can see a difference. Tanned skins are usually fairly dark in color. They're usually brownish before they're dyed, whereas tawed skin is often really white. It can be almost chalk white, depending on exactly the process used, or sort of more creamy white color, which means that it can then also be dyed, but it often wasn't. It's often left undyed because it's actually quite beautiful. It's just a really light color. It has a lighter, you can see these sort of yellowish veins running through it. It's pretty. So it's something that it's chemically different, and it's visually different, and it's physically feels different. Tawed skins are generally softer. They tend to stay soft. They don't dry out and sort of become brittle like leather sometimes can. So it's a really good choice for binding, especially for the sewing supports. You usually see, even if you've got your book covered in a tanned leather, it's often sewn on a tawed leather support. So it's, so that, because that needs to flex and needs to stay flexible over centuries, it's a really good choice. But people also used it as a covering material. It's not, you know, it was particularly popular, I think, in Germany. Is that, no, that's my French line. Yeah, actually, I don't know why I just said Germany. I'm looking at the wrong thing. But anyway, it was also used as a covering material, and it does stay nice and soft over time.
And what about cloth? I can see a bit of it in the 19th and 20th century, and then a bit of embroidered fabric in 15th to 16th century. Is it just survival bias?
Quite possibly, yes. Fabric, if it's not specifically made for bookbinding, is generally more fragile. It's going to be more easily abraded and torn and worn out. But I think the earlier bindings that you see, these embroidered bindings, there's an entire study of this kind of material that's really fascinating that I didn't get into just yet, but it's, but those tended to be these very beautiful luxury items. So they would have been very carefully kept and preserved. And you know, they would have been something that people took a lot of time to make, and they would have been presentation bindings or gifts. And so they would have been pretty carefully preserved. So I think that's why those early embroidered bindings survive. It would not surprise me if fabric was used much earlier than that, but it just hasn't lasted.
I wanted to take a step back to the previous chart just for a moment because I was very interested in the Spanish part of this chart, and it would be so I don't know, entertaining to step even back in the centuries to know what was used in Spain, or in the territory of the modern Spain before the pasteboards were used there. And the other thing that's interesting is that was the introduction of pasteboards in Spain influence of the European tradition or of the Islamic tradition, because it was introduced was it 14th century or something like that. So it was at the end of Reconquista, and well,
you're absolutely right that this came, the conjecture is that this came from the Islamic world and the Islamic binding tradition, and that's why it's in Spain before it's in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that that's where that comes from. As I've noted on this chart, that early date is kind of a guess, but it seems plausible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think it would really be nice to have some early Spanish bindings. I don't have a resource for those yet. If someone out there has one, I would love to know about it. But yes, it would be fascinating to know what else they were using, because the climate there is quite different from other parts of Europe. So what kind of wood were they using? They must have been using wooden boards before then, but
yeah.
What was it? That would be fascinating.
Yes, as we have some plans for starting a Spanish branch of our podcast, I hope we will have guests in the future who will be able to shed some light on this thing. And the other thing is that we definitely need someone who will tell us more about the Islamic tradition, because we already started discussing this topic with Kathy Abbott some time ago, and it was very interesting. And but really it was only a short part of a larger talk, and we definitely need to return to this topic because it's a huge world of different styles and traditions within this name of umbrella of Islamic bindings.
And also for the 14th century, you'd have to look probably at Mozarabic books, which is a topic all on itself. Christian monasteries under Muslim rules, a fascinating tradition in terms of illumination and manuscripts, but I know nothing about what was going on in terms of binding there. They probably melded their own traditions with incoming ones, and also a big Jewish substrate in those states also must have somehow influenced it.
Well, that's another topic we want to cover in one of our future podcasts, because we definitely wanted to talk about books that were found in Genizas and to discuss the moment when Jewish tradition switched, at least partially switched from scrolls to codices, because scrolls are in the Jewish tradition until now. How should I say?
Still.
Yeah, still. so yeah, but there definitely was a moment when codex was introduced to the Jewish tradition, and well, we need some more guests who will tell us more about these stories.
Absolutely.
One more general thing I wanted to ask you. I'm a scientist by training, so when I see a research project like yours, first of all, I'm envious and in awe, but I also look at it as a hypothesis building thing. You are doing a review of existing literature, you are forming certain hypotheses, and the next stage would probably be testing those hypotheses. What would be your dream work trip? Where would you like to go and see the real things and test your suggestions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, this has been kind of a frustrating time to try and do this with not being able to travel anywhere. But now I would love to do the book tour of Europe. There are lots of places I would like to see. I would really want to visit at least one significant collection of books in each country, just to see what's different about each tradition and where these things come from. and I know that there are some wonderful collections, say in Trinity College in Dublin, or there are some libraries in Italy that I've only recently found out about that are just really tempting. There's one in Venice. I have forgotten the name of it off the top of my head, but it's a place that had a significant collection of medieval chained bindings, and they are still there and they're still chained to the desks. That would be just amazing to see. But yes, I think there was a bindery in Portugal that I was recently reading about, or sorry, a library in Portugal that had some old bindings that had a different lacing pattern for lacing on their supports into the wooden covers, that it was different from anywhere else that people had seen before. And I believe it's north of Lisbon. So, I've never been to Portugal. I'd love to go and take a look at these things. Before the pandemic came down, we had actually planned to go to Italy for a month and visit Florence and Venice and take a look at some bindings. And it's, it's on hold, but I'm hoping eventually to have a chance to go and take a look.
That's another thing I wanted to ask you. How well documented are binding collections? Because I've been working on cataloging photographs of bindings from British Library. They have photographed all their bindings. That's very impressive.
Oh, yes.
But then you are lucky if you have general dimensions. They don't describe it in detail. They don't take photographs of inside of it. They don't photograph endbands, etc., etc., etc. So I assume it's still mostly you have to go and see them.
Yeah, you're right about the British Library. They have at least made a really good start on that process. But what's interesting is that a lot of places that have any binding information, they pretty much only show you a photograph of the front cover because they're interested in the decoration, which is also fascinating. And I am going to talk a little bit about that in a future article. In fact, that's the one that's the next one after the one I'm working on now. So it's, that's what the main interest is for a lot of that kind of documentation. Other libraries have done that too, but there are some in New York that have images up of their bindings as well. But you're right, there aren't a lot of pictures of more structural aspects. And that's kind of a shame because that makes it harder to do this kind of research ahead of time so that when you do get the chance to actually go and look at things in the flesh, that you've already done your research and you know exactly which ones you want to look at. That would be nice. But yeah, I think there's definitely a market for this. I think more people are getting interested in historical structures and what they can teach us. And it's becoming more of an interest. There was this dark period where people would just rebind things. They wouldn't really document what they'd found. It's broken, let's just fix it. And so we've lost a lot of information, but that's changing. And I think conservators are more and more interested in these older structures and preserving their existence. But we also do need to just document things more. But yeah, that would be a dream job, wouldn't it? You go to a famous library collection and your job is to photograph the structures and describe them and put them online. How fabulous would that be?
Yeah, there's definitely this clash between interests of, I guess, librarians and book historian, codicologists, conservators, because as Pavel, as you discussed with Pavel, at best we have photos of covers and maybe sometimes in some rare cases of spines, but it's not really hard to make just a couple more photos and give much more information to a much wider spectrum of specialists. And well, it unfortunately it wasn't done in the previous decades, and it is not always done now and not all of the libraries are ready to start doing this in the upcoming years. So I only can hope that this approach will change soon, because well, it will be much more time. It will need much more time to revisit all these books and to understand what additional photos are needed to be made to complete the description of the book, visual description of the book.
And certainly it couldn't be a one-man job. That sounds like a really big project. How would you approach starting such an object? Where would you get funding for that? Who funds that sort of research? Other funding bodies that are interested in those kind of things?
That's a really good question. I mean, and it's certainly a part of human cultural history, right? I think you could make an argument that it contributes to historical study. Yeah, that's a good question. Believe me, if I find out, I'm going to apply.
I've been thinking it could also be of interest to antique booksellers, because so often you see a book being sold online and it's very well dated in terms of the text, but the binding, they can often only say either how old it is plus or minus a century, and roughly the region where it comes from. It's better for famous binders for famous collections, but overall dating of bindings is still a very, very approximate science.
Yeah. And actually that's a lot of why I started doing this, is that there isn't a lot of sort of concentrated information about this. So this whole project was me trying to wrap my head around some of these historical details. Okay, where did this start? When did it start? How long were people doing this? So yeah, that's really, I think a lot of places have or a lot of people have addressed small parts of this. And so what I've been trying to do is try to gather them together in one place. I don't know how successful it's been, but it's helped me. And I'm sort of hoping that it'll help other people get a little bit of a handle on this stuff. And in a perfect world, this would keep going. Like, more people would add to this. It doesn't have to be just me. This is what I can find, but there's more out there, I think. And like I was saying yesterday, I only speak so many languages, and it's not very many, but it would be great to include sources from other places and in other languages, and sort of collaborate more with people on what they know of the history of binding where they are. I'm not even there, but I can gather some things. So yeah, and I'm hopeful that I think the interest in this stuff has been growing. I'm not the first person to take an interest in this by any stretch. So I think I'm hopeful that it will kind of grow and more people will be interested in learning about binding history and preserving evidence of it. It seems like it's happening.
Yesterday we mentioned Byzantine bindings, and I wrote a letter to a friend of mine who studies Byzantine art, and she said there's a body of work done on it in Italian and in Russian. I mean, here's another example. There are scientists studying it now in Russia, but none of them even speak English. So that would be difficult too. They usually speak, for some reason, Italian, but so maybe a collaboration one day would be great. How are you disseminating your work? Because Stepan only found out about it recently, and when I was doing my searches on the topic, like a year ago, I also couldn't find your work. Are you talking at conferences? Are you planning to publish a book?
You know, I'm hopeful that I could do both of those things. You know, I haven't presented at a conference since I was a science student. So it's been a very long time since I've done a public presentation. That doesn't mean I won't, but you know, I haven't got plans for such a thing yet. So the articles I've been writing have just been published in this guild newsletter, which, you know, members of the guild can certainly get. And some of them are now online, and it takes some time for these things to get up there. So they are available. The ones I've written so far, most of them are already online. But it would, I think, be nice to kind of gather them somewhere and make them into something a little more coherent. I've sort of daydreamed about making a book out of it. I wonder just how easy it would be to do that, and who would be interested in publishing such a thing. I mean, I don't know. I've been doing it because I like it, and I've been sharing it because I think some people will get something out of it. I don't know whether, it seems like it's kind of at this middle ground where it's quasi-educated. You know, I've learned a lot, but I'm no expert on most of these things. I'm just gathering information from other experts. So I don't know, is that a book? Would that sell? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe only like 20 copies.
Maybe a website. Well, for a scientific book to sell 500 copies is a great success. Which, when you think how many hours go into it, it's always a labor of love and hardly ever for profit.
Right. That's true. That's true. And you know, at this point, it's grown so much from what it originally was. You know, when I first wrote the paper that started all of this, I had 4 charts, and that was it. And they were all pretty minimal, frankly. Like, they had some stuff on them, but they're not as detailed as the ones that actually became part of the articles got to. And for me, the charts are such an interesting part of it. And I like laying out information in a visual way that, to me, makes it easier to comprehend. And I think a lot of people who are artistically minded would sort of appreciate that. So yeah, I think part of me wants to publish it myself and do the binding and then sell it that way, and just for the fun of doing it that way. But yeah, I don't know. I think it is the next question, because I'm approaching the end of the series that I was planning, and that series has gotten longer and longer. You know, each time I start writing a new article, I realize, oh, this is too much. I've got to split it into 2 or 3 chunks. So the number of articles has sort of grown as time has gone on. But I do think I'm approaching the end now, because I'm on the cover. I started with the paper, and now I'm on the cover. So I'm getting near the end of the articles. So yeah, figuring out what to do with them next is my big question.
I wanted to ask you about an element of book structure that I'm particularly fond of, and it's Endbands. And you wrote an article.
No.
I think it was a second one in the series. And this is something that I always, notice. And the first thing that, if I see an old book in a museum, I always try to check what are the endbands and how they are made. Did you find anything interesting and strange while you were researching this part of the book?
Endbands. Let's see. Yes, there was a lot about endbands. So let me show you that chart.
It's actually really weird. When we go to exhibitions, I immediately go and look at illumination in detail, like from as close as possible. And Stepan goes from the back and looks at the end bands.
And I always hate it, because almost every time books are placed in a way that you cannot really see most of the structural elements. And yeah, I hate it.
I know, I'm always the one who's like crouching down to look underneath to see if I can see the spine or the tail. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a horrible person to take to a museum exhibit. And because I also like freak out about how things are displayed. Oh, that should really be supported better. It's it's awful. But yes, actually, Endbands are fascinating. There are so many different varieties, and because there's so much scope for decoration, even though it can also be a structural element, I think they vary tremendously over time and space. Carolingian endbands are really part of the attachment between the cover and the text block. It's sewn through a spine lining and through the cover material. So that's not unusual from these early endbands to be actually physically part of the cover material attachment. And that's kind of fascinating. But then that stops and it becomes more about attaching the boards more than attaching the cover material. So they're sewn onto the same kind of core that is used for the sewing supports, or actually sometimes a different type of core. The French bindings that Dennis Carvin looks at in his survey, that's where he sees that some experiments were being done with the Endband cores before they were used for sewing supports. So you see cord instead of leather or Allen Todd skin. And then you see other kinds of things, like they're the rolled cores, as opposed to just a strip. It's actually been rolled to make it stiffer. And so that was an experiment as well. And then you get different parts of a sewn endband. You get the primary sewing, which is often very plain and is usually the same thread as the rest of the sewing. But then you get this embroidery over top of that with all kinds of things. And often it's really fancy with silk threads and multiple colors and different patterns, multiple cores added on that don't have any structural feature whatsoever, but they're there to make it pretty. And so there's a lot going on with an endband. There was also this interesting argument over whether the endband was sewn at the same time as the rest of the sewing or not.
By the same person or not?
Right, by the same person or at the same time or two different times, two different people. Yeah, and that's really an interesting question. And there was definitely an argument among the sources I was looking at, where some folks were saying, well, it's certainly possible, but we can't be sure. It looks like it's sewn, because there are some cases where it was pretty obvious, like the Carvin books, he saw some of them that were sewn without a kettle stitch, because instead of making a kettle stitch and going to the next signature, whoever was sewing it was also sewing on an endband at the same time. So it's clear in that case, because there's no kettle stitch, you can't have sewn it separately. It has to be part of the original sewing. But in other places, you couldn't tell, because it's the same kind of thread and it goes through the last, the tie downs go through where the kettle stitch is, but for whatever reason, you can't see whether there's a kettle stitch or not, or because it's in good enough condition that you can't actually get in there and look at it, or because it's just otherwise not obvious whether there's a kettle stitch. Yeah, so there are lots of different ways you can make an endband. And if it's not sewn at the same time as the rest of the sewing, if it breaks, you can replace it. And so you sometimes end up with an endband that's newer than the rest of the sewing and the rest of the materials. That's sort of, again, part of this history of a usable object that gets used and worn out and then refurbished centuries after it was originally bound, or sometimes more quickly than that. And then you much later are looking at it and trying to figure out, okay, how old is this? Well, this part is from this century, but that part's from a different century. So yeah, those are fascinating. I also found it interesting how early the stuck-on Endband was. You can get these Endbands that were sewn separately onto a piece of vellum and then just stuck on the spine. So they're not as modern as you would think. Like the current sort of woven fabric ones that you see on even contemporary books, you know, that seems like a shortcut that is just to make it look like an old book or look like books are expected to look. But that idea of sticking on a non-structural endband is actually earlier than that. You can see them from the late 16th century, early 17th century.
That's interesting, yeah, because I often use modern stuck-on endbands and as a symbol of this modern industrial bookmaking and symbol of this pursuit for making a book cheaper and cheaper in production. And but well, as you said, it isn't, or it isn't only that.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too, because the modern ones are, you know, machine woven, right? They're mass produced, right? But these early stuck-on endbands, they were still sewn by hand. There's still a piece of embroidery. It wasn't any faster to do it this way, except that you could have someone specializing in that. You could have one person who only does embroidered endbands that are then stuck onto a book that someone else has sewn. And so it's a different skill and it's a different focus, I guess. So that's one way it speeds things up, because while one person is over here sewing, a different person is sewing the endband, and then they can come together more quickly because the endband's already done.
And where and when does it appear again?
I had it as showing up right around the turn of the 16th to the 17th century. And we see them in Germany and we see them in England.
It would be interesting to see the context where it appears, because it could be in places where book trade got really advanced. Like I know many things connected to how you produce the actual manuscript got specialized in Paris and other university towns, where you had to produce many books and as cheap as possible. So it could be something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Definitely the education market, you know, these towns that had big universities early on, that's where you see a lot of these innovations, is precisely for that reason, that the students need books and they have no money. So you want to make them as cheaply as you possibly can. And then, you know, so you come up with ways to make it faster so you can make it cheaper.
I read everything I could by Christopher de Hamel, and at some point I stumbled upon his PhD, which was written quite a few decades ago. And his PhD was on book trade in Paris, and it's fascinating how well documented it is. You can actually make a guided tour, which he did, showing where who lived. Like, here lived this bookbinder, here lived this bookseller, and they knew each other because their children were married, and so on. And in his PhD he traces how the trade evolved with university evolving. So that's a really fascinating thing. And another thing on the chart, you don't have to show it again, but I just noticed this thing, how on the part of the chart where you discuss English endbands, there is Stonyhurst Gospel, and there is a big gap until until it goes on. And endbands on Stonyhurst Gospel are made in a different technique than in a later one. And it just shows how much we not only don't know, but also don't even have a chance to know. There's basically no chance we'll find more bindings from the 8th or 9th century in England. Well, except for the Fedden Moor Gospel, which they found in a bog in Ireland. But I don't think it's going to be a frequent occurrence.
there are only so many bogs to dig up, right? Yes, it's absolutely true. There are these big gaps, at least in what I've been able to find. I'm sure there's more out there. I've just begun to scratch the surface on this. There's a lot to learn and there's a lot to discover, but it's true. There are definitely going to be gaps where things just haven't survived, and it's unfortunate, but it's just sort of part of history. You know, there are lots of gaps in history that we don't know how to fill.
Pavel went, I don't know, I think several times to digging locations at in Novgorod where birchwood texts are uncovered in many different locations, and I think it may be an interesting thing to share as well.
I wasn't lucky neither to find one nor to be present when they find one, but a week before I came and 2 days after I left, they found small birchwood manuscripts with letters, and actually like 5 meters from where I was digging, what was it, 20 years ago, they found the oldest Russian book. It was well, I say book. It was more. It was a set of wooden tablets,
Right.
but it was a part of a psalter, more than 1,000-year-old. So you can still find them in some places. Maybe something new will turn up.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, with all those charts, are you approaching that moment when you can take a binding, describe it, look at your charts, and make a guess where and when it could have been made?
Yes, actually, just barely. Sometimes, if I'm lucky. But yes, I had this experience early on when I started writing these. I went to the special collections at Wellesley just for a completely different purpose. And there was a book sitting on the table, and I looked at it and I said, that was bound in Germany probably in the 14th century. I was really excited because I had just been reading about, German bindings from that period. It's like, oh, hey, this has this feature and that feature. And it was pretty clear to me. So when I'm really focused on writing and I've just been learning new things, and then I'm exposed to a book that I haven't seen before, this does happen to me where I'm like, oh, hey, I can figure out where this was. So yeah, so that has been something really exciting to fall out of this, is that especially if I sort of walk away from the charts for a while and then I come back to them and look at them again, things start to fall into place and I realize, oh yeah, I'm actually learning a lot. So yeah, that's really fun.
I guess we need to finish this episode. It was a great to talk to you, Emily, and yeah, I wanted to add that we will add links to your articles, to PDFs of your articles below in the description, as well as a link to the website of the Guild of Bookworkers. And I wanted to ask everybody to like this video, share, subscribe to our channel, join the crowd on Patreon, and maybe become one of our paid members, because it's really important to us. We cover editing of these videos with the money that comes from our patrons, and without them we wouldn't be here. Thanks again for joining us and for talking to us. Thank you. Thanks to everybody, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.